She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. There was no fire falling from the sky. Just a woman, sitting quietly in the back of the temple, crying so hard her lips moved, but no sound came out. No one understood her, not even the priest. He thought she was drunk, but God knew, God heard, and from that silent, shaking moment, He wrote a miracle. So here's the question. How can a prayer with no words still shake heaven? Let's talk about that. This isn't just about Hannah, it's about you. Have you ever prayed and didn't even know what to say? Not because you didn't believe, but because the pain was too deep for words. Maybe you sat in a church service, surrounded by people who seemed fine, while you were quietly breaking apart on the inside. Tears filled your eyes, but you kept them hidden. Because how do you explain the kind of ache that doesn't make sense to anyone but God? That's where Hannah was. She didn't have a polished prayer. She didn't even speak out loud. She just showed up and poured out her heart in silence. And heaven moved. This story isn't just about a woman from the Bible. It's about you. You, the one holding things together. You, the one who's been praying without answers. You, the one whose voice is shaking or gone altogether. This isn't a message for the loud or the bold. It's a reminder for the quiet, the overlooked, the ones still waiting. Because sometimes, peace doesn't come with a miracle. It comes with a whisper. And that's what this video is all about. 1. The weight she carried wasn't just barrenness. It was shame. When we talk about Hannah, most people remember the miracle, the answered prayer, the birth of Samuel, the prophet who would anoint kings. But before the miracle came years of silence. And a weight Hannah carried quietly, every single day. Yes, she was barren. But that word, barren, barely scratches the surface of what it meant to live her life. In ancient Israel, a woman's value was often tied to her ability to bear children, not just for the joy of motherhood, but for identity, honor, legacy. So to be childless, especially for years, wasn't just heartbreaking. It was humiliating. You didn't just feel empty. You were seen as empty, and people treated you that way. Hannah didn't just carry a silent ache. She carried shame, and worse. That shame had a name. Peninnah. Her husband Elkanah had 2 wives. Peninnah had children. Hannah did not. And Peninnah wasn't quiet about it. She used her fertility like a weapon, taunting Hannah year after year, especially when they came to the house of the Lord. Imagine that. You show up at the one place where you hope to find comfort, and you're met with cruelty. The Bible says Peninnah provoked her bitterly to irritate her. It was intentional. It was personal. And it worked. Hannah wept. She couldn't eat. She couldn't speak. Her whole body reacted to the pain, like grief had taken root in her bones. And what did Elkanah, her husband, say? "Why are you crying? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" He meant well, but he didn't understand. Because grief like Hannah's isn't solved by comfort or compliments. It's deeper. It's soul level. She wasn't just missing something. She felt erased, invisible, less than. And if you've ever walked through a season like that, you know the kind of silence I'm talking about. When you avoid the questions because you don't have answers. When you cheer for others, but go home with a heaviness you can't explain. When it feels like God is listening to everyone else's prayers, except yours. But here's the sacred beauty in Hannah's story. She didn't let that shame keep her from God. She didn't numb it. She didn't fake it. She brought it, raw, unfiltered, into the temple. She knelt down. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The priest thought she was drunk, because the kind of grief she had, it didn't fit into anyone's theology. But God knew. Because real prayer doesn't always sound pretty. Sometimes it doesn't sound at all. Sometimes it's just being there, not strong, not composed, just present. Hannah's story reminds us, God sees the pain behind the performance. He hears the prayer buried beneath the silence. And He responds. Not to your volume, but to your heart. That's the turning point. Before the miracle, before the pregnancy, before the breakthrough, God met Hannah in her honesty. She brought her sorrow, her longing, her shame, and offered it without a script, no demands, no guarantees, just faith in the form of tears. And that was enough. So if you've ever thought your silence meant God wasn't listening, think again, because maybe the most powerful prayers aren't the ones people hear, but the ones heaven does. Now let's go deeper. Because what happened next wasn't about a miracle yet. It was about a woman who stayed when everything in her wanted to give up. 2. She didn't scream. She just stayed. Hannah had every reason to leave. She could have walked out. She could have shouted back at Peninnah. She could have told God, I'm done showing up for a God who won't show up for me. But she didn't. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just stayed. After all the mocking, after the misunderstanding from her husband, after years of silent pain, Hannah chose to enter the temple, not as a warrior, not as someone full of hope, but as a woman, barely holding it together. And when she got there, she didn't put on a holy face. She didn't rehearse a perfect prayer. She wept in silence. No words came out, just movement of her lips, just pain poured out before a God she still believed was listening, even when it didn't feel like it. What happens next is telling. The high priest, Eli, saw her, and instead of recognizing the sacredness of what she was doing, he assumed she was drunk. He saw the outside, but missed the weight of what was happening on the inside. And isn't that what happens to us sometimes? You show up in your rawest moments, and people misread you. They think you're weak, or dramatic, or unstable, when in truth, you're doing the hardest thing imaginable, bringing your pain to God when it would be easier to run away. That's what Hannah did. She didn't curse. She didn't collapse. She didn't leave. She stayed. And that kind of quiet courage, that's what faith looks like when you're out of words. When she finally speaks to Eli, she says, I'm not drunk. I'm pouring out my soul before the Lord. Not making a scene, not trying to get attention, just laying bare the ache in the only place she still had left to go. It wasn't a bold speech. It wasn't full of eloquence. It was a whisper from the core of who she was. And that is what moved heaven. Because God isn't drawn to noise. He's drawn to honesty. The quiet kind, the trembling kind, the kind that says, I have nothing left, but I'm still here. That moment, right there, where Hannah had nothing polished, nothing dignified, nothing spiritual to offer, was exactly when God leaned in. And what happened next? Everything began to shift. But not because her circumstances changed yet. They didn't. She didn't leave the temple pregnant. She didn't leave with proof. She left with peace because something in her heart settled. Not because she got what she wanted, but because she gave God what was real. And when that happens, you don't walk away the same. Let's step into that turning point where peace comes before the promise. 3. God doesn't need volume. He responds to vulnerability. Hannah didn't make a grand speech. She didn't bargain with God or promise him fame in exchange for favor. She didn't perform. She just broke. And in that breaking, she offered something heaven never turns away from. Truth. Not loud, not pretty, just raw. In a culture where prayers were often long, poetic, and public, Hannah's prayer looked strange. No volume, no show, just her lips moving silently, and her tears doing the talking. And yet, that's the moment that moved heaven. Because God has never needed noise to respond. He's never been impressed by performance. What he responds to, what he's always been drawn to, is vulnerability. The kind that whispers, "I don't have anything left, but I trust you anyway." The scripture doesn't say she convinced God. It doesn't say she earned the blessing. It simply says something almost too gentle to notice. And the Lord remembered her. 1 Samuel 1:19. That's it. No flash, no lightning, just remembrance. And that word, remembered, it doesn't mean God had forgotten her. It means God responded at the right time, to a heart he had never taken his eyes off. That verse holds a quiet kind of beauty, because so many of us feel forgotten when life doesn't move, when prayers feel unanswered, when months turn into years, and the silence feels deafening. But Hannah's story reminds us, he hears what no one else hears. He sees what no one else sees, and he honors what no one else knows how to value. Your silent tears? They don't vanish into the air. They rise, they carry weight, and God catches every one of them. Because sometimes, the strongest prayers aren't shouted in churches. They're whispered on bedroom floors. They're spoken with cracked voices in hospital waiting rooms. They're the prayers that never even make it into words, because your heart is too tired to speak. And still, he remembers. Not just what you prayed, but how you stayed. Not just what you said, but how you kept showing up. With nothing but honesty. Hannah's story isn't just about getting a son. It's about a woman who brought her emptiness and left with peace. Because even before Samuel was born, God met her in her surrender and called that surrender enough. So if you've ever felt like your quiet doesn't matter, if you've wondered whether heaven notices people like you, people who cry in silence, people who pray without perfect words, know this. You don't need volume. You just need vulnerability. Because the Lord remembers. Always. And that is where the miracle truly begins. Faith doesn't have to be loud to be real. Hannah isn't remembered because she stood tall. She's remembered because she knelt low. She wasn't celebrated for being bold. She was remembered because she dared to be broken in front of God. She didn't bring strength to the altar. She brought silence, tears, and a heart too tired to pretend. And that was enough. Because real faith, it doesn't always sound like shouting. Sometimes it's just breathing through the tears and whispering, "Lord, I'm still here." You don't need the right words. You don't need to be impressive. You just need to show up, honest and open. And when you do, he hears you, even when you're quiet, even when you feel unseen, even when you have nothing left but the ache, just like Hannah, and maybe just like you. So if this message met you today, if you've been carrying silent prayers of your own, take a moment, click like, not for the algorithm, but as a way of saying, that was me. I needed that. Share it with someone you know is praying in silence right now, because they may not have the words either, but this might be the whisper they needed. And if Hannah's quiet pain sounds like your own, then you need to hear the story of Ruth, a woman whose loyalty, not her loudness, led her to a love she didn't expect. Watch next. Ruth's loyalty, God's blessing through devotion. Let it remind you, God doesn't just see loud faith, he blesses quiet devotion.